Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Also, welcome to the first talk of the Best of Water Systems Research series, which is being organized by the Center for Water Informatics and Technology at LUMS in Pakistan. So this is the first talk. So before I introduce the speaker, I would like to invite the director of the center, Dr. Abu Bakr Muhammad, to say a few words about the seminar series, what's the philosophy behind it, and what type of speakers we hope to bring to all of you in the future. So, sir.
Okay, thank you, Talha. I think I will not take too much of the time away from Andrew. We already have a short slot, and I would really like the speaker to have the bulk of the time available. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes, just first of all, to welcome you all, and also to just say a couple of words about like why we are launching this new series. As many of you who are affiliated with the center or follow our activities know that we already have a webinar series by the name of IBIS, which is basically where leading practitioners, policymakers, opinion makers, journalists, students, researchers, I mean, we gather around, we talk. Essentially, the purpose of that series is public awareness, distilling the science and making it easy for people to understand. And mostly we are focused on Pakistan and the Indus Basin, if you want to call it, but mainly focused on Pakistan and South Asia sometimes. The reason that I thought, actually we thought at the center that maybe we need to have an alternate forum was that in Pakistan especially, there are many other forums who are doing similar to things similar to what we are doing in the IBIS series. And if you look at our intellectual discourse as well regarding water, usually we have these big events where usually a minister is called in, some very high-level officials come in, some university academics are also there. There's a lot of pump and show. Usually there is a prediction of a doom 5 years down the road, the sky is going to fall and all that. There are a couple of angry people in the room as well. So I mean that's what I've been observing, that for some time that has been going on. And usually the science is dumbed down. Science is dumbed down to the point where serious researchers and practitioners, of course, are not able to really understand why the charts are being shown, why the figures are being shared. And of course, a lot of research actually gets published in journals and conferences, and those are venues where this research really deserves to be discussed in more detail. But what we wanted to do was basically to create a forum where we can learn from others. And we give people, top experts in the world, time to explain their science, their methods, whatever their methods are. And essentially not with the idea to have something ready in the next 6 months to be deployed in the next 6 months. We have to have kind of a long-term view of where the beauty of the science, of course, the beauty of the scholarship, and where things are going as far as the academic discipline is concerned, and where there are these new emerging ideas from where we can learn from, whether it is within the sort of the intellectual sort of landscape or in other regions of the world. So this is really the idea. We are not restricted to Pakistan here. We are not restricted to doing certain kind of methodological methods, although we have a little slight bend towards data sort of focused system analytics, systems thinking kind of ideas. That is why the series is called Best of Water Systems Analysis. Now, just last comment about the word best of. Talha and I actually had a long conversation about it, because the minute that you put something as the best, then there is really criticism about like where is this coming from. We even try to think of alternate names as well. So the pick of the speakers and the various topics, I mean that we will take the responsibility of picking up the best. So hopefully you will forgive us. You may have looked at the lineup of future speakers. I think these are all wonderful people who are doing really wonderful work, and there is much to be learned from them. And I hope that in today's session and in these later sessions of the series, we will look at these things in sort of a calm way, digest the science of the scholarship, whatever that is, and then try to chart a discourse from there. So that's all from my side, and I welcome you all, and I welcome Andrew. I think this first talk is a brilliant pick, in the sense that this is exactly the right kind of mix between methods and impact. We have been following Andrew's work for quite some time now. Some of his papers are really, really very influential, at least for us, for our work. And we would really like to hear more about what he has to say. So over to Talha, and please take it forward.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Abu Bakr, for that wonderful introduction to the series. We'll start right away. So I want to introduce the speaker. So Dr. Andrew Bell, he is an assistant professor at the Department of Earth and Environment at the Boston University. He did his bachelor's and master's in environmental engineering from the University of Waterloo and Waseda University, respectively. He did his PhD in natural resource management from the University of Michigan. And he studies livelihood and resource decision making, including domains of irrigation, pest management, ecosystem services, technology adoption, and migration. And much of his work applies survey and experimental tools to identify and model behavior and to understand what these behaviors imply for system level outcomes under scenarios of environmental change. He has done a bunch of work in Pakistan as well, and is very much familiar with our systems and the Indus Basin in general. So I think it's a great opportunity to hear from him. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation and the kind introduction. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, oops, and I've gone blurry. I don't know what to do about that. I'm gonna let it ride. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to talk today about a body of work that I've done over the last 10 years or so with my IMI colleagues, Azim Shah and Arif Anwar, as well as a few other IFPI colleagues along the way. And for today, this talk, I want to talk for less than 40 minutes, hopefully closer to 30. And I have 4 kind of parts. I want to start with a working definition and a sort of a model for the process of water governance. And I want to use that then to think a little bit about sort of big picture directions for governance in the IBIS, and then a bit more into sort of operationally, what does it mean for water governance? What are the things that we can do? And I'm going to focus on providing improved information about flow and what people are doing. And then I want to tie that in to close with sort of a metaphor for good pro-poor governance and the role of technology in making governance work. All of the literature, whether it's mine or other people's that I'm citing in this talk, I've put in this folder, and I think I can share it in the chat. There we go. So in this folder, you find all of the papers that I'm talking about, in case it's helpful to dig in and find a detail while we're talking, because I may jump over things quicker than you might like. Okay, so to start, I want to talk about governance with the goal of making it distinct from processes of management. And so often when I talk about governance, I focus on what are the things that matter to people? What do people respond to? And broadly, there are things like money, rules, and other people. More formally, we refer to those as markets, government, and civil society, or sometimes in the governance or governance literature, you might see these referred to as markets, hierarchies, and networks. And they do different things. They're sort of different pillars of toolkits that motivate people. Markets are really helpful at moving resources to more efficient uses. Civil society and government are really helpful at managing how those resources are equitably distributed. So complementary goals, complementary effects from across these different pillars of governance. From a process perspective, what does governance mean? And at the same time, what does management mean? So the working definition that we've been using in our recent work is to talk about the process of setting objectives for how a resource gets used and then meeting those objectives. So good governance is about the processes involved in setting those objectives. And importantly, going up one level further, it's about creating fair and appropriate, legitimate spaces in which we can set those objectives. And then good management is about doing the best we can to meet the objectives that we've set. So in our work in the last little while, we've tried to put this in context for the IBIS and big irrigation systems. And so we have a little bit of a working model. So if we're looking here at this row from the middle of the screen to the right, you have some hydrologic system, you have rainfall, you have whatever you have, giving you stream flow, giving you underground flow, mediating that through the infrastructure that we build, the hardware that we set in place, channels, storages, etc. We then have some set of rules in place that we'll call the software of the system, that give us some set of final flows and a water supply at some place, at some elevation, at some time. This is the most basic way that we could think about water being used. But there's more to it than that. We haven't explained how the hardware got there. We haven't explained how the software got there. And so in practice, for whatever water supply we're talking about, we have some set of users. And importantly, we have some set of distinct uses. We may have agriculture, we may have drinking water supply and sanitation. We may have industries, energy. We have different users, different uses. We may have users who participate in multiple different uses. And they are going to have some set of priorities. They're going to have some set of goals. And so ideally, our water resources planning process takes into account, knows what it is that people need, what they want, and prioritizes capital investments and infrastructure on the one hand, and then objectives, rules, institutions on the other hand, that do the best at matching that supply to the needs of our users. So that's not everything. Ideally, we have systems in place that allow us, as part of our planning process, to know not just what people need, but what we have and how things are performing. So building this model in this way, we can borrow from the work of Claudia Paulwasserloo, the most eminent water scholar that I know of, to apply a triple loop learning approach to thinking about what governance is as a process. So in this top row, we have what we call single loop learning. So changes along that top row are kind of just twisting the knobs, raising the levels, maybe adjusting the gates a little bit to better meet objectives within the software that we've provided. And then as we move further down in this plot, we're getting into bigger questions about have we made the best objectives available? Have we used the best tools, prices, rules, subsidies, whatever? And have we involved the right people in the right way to be able to choose the right objectives? So in practice, really what we're talking about in this top row are management tools. So single loop learning, meeting objectives, management. And then as we move further down, double loop learning, triple loop learning, we're getting more into governance processes. And I guess sort of one further way to think about the distinction between governance and management is that at the top of this screen, we're really thinking about resource outcomes. We're worried about, did we get the supply that we wanted? And as we move down towards the bottom from single to double and triple loop learning, we're thinking about process outcomes. Do we have the right tools in place, and do we have the right spaces to involve people to set those tools? And so to the extent that you're concerned about resource outcomes, we're really looking at a management problem. And to the extent that we're concerned about good process, we're thinking about governance. So in the things that we'll talk about today, that's the best I can do, I think, up to now, of distinguishing governance and management. And so this is from work that's in prep with Azim and Arif. And maybe this seems simple, maybe it still seems kind of unnecessarily complicated, but the truth is it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because I played a little bit of a trick by making this assumption that we can easily talk about a clear and distinct water supply with boundaries and an associated set of users. And that's important. I mean, good resource governance requires that we have a nice boundary for what is our supply, what is our resource, and who's using it. But in reality, that part, which I've assumed away here, is quite difficult to get to. And as we talk a little bit about the IBIS and the massive system that it is, the ability to make that assumption kind of fades away a little bit. We have challenges of thinking, what is the supply and who are the users we're talking about and how should they be involved in the process? And we get a little bit stuck. So I want to talk for just a moment about that third triple loop learning row and talk about, do we have the best space for setting objectives in the IBIS? So scaling up from the simple world that I painted in the previous slide, where perhaps, we have a lake or a pond or something, we know each other and we can share it in some open and transparent way. As we get bigger, it gets harder non-linearly, because big systems aren't just big versions of small systems. They're very, very different. So water supplies become very segmented. Users are less connected. You have flows crossing boundaries. And water that's at different places at different times with different quality isn't the same. They have different utilities, and our ability to trade and share across uses is different once that segmentation really comes into play. So we know a lot about how to govern resources from the work of Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, whose work started half a century ago and grew into what we call common property resource theory. And there are a couple of basic things that we know are really critical in order to be good at governing resources. We need to have the clearly defined resource boundaries and users that I assumed away in the previous model. That's kind of a basic thing that we need. We also need for those users to be able to organize, to be able to join together, to be able to tailor the rules that apply to them and the other users within those boundaries. And we need to be able to enforce those rules. We need to be able to resolve conflicts. If we don't have these basic things, we get stuck. And then whatever it is that we're dealing with at whatever scale, it has to be intercompatible with whatever other problems we're dealing with at different scales. And so the world of CPR, common property resource governance, is what we would call a polycentric world, where we have centers of governance at different scales dealing with different problems. And whatever it is that we're doing at one scale has to make sense with all the other things that are happening. So that's kind of a distillation of things that we need. And these get really, really difficult to do when the systems grow and grow and grow. And this isn't for lack of trying. We've got decades of experience trying different things, and the sort of the front runner and the big deal across the world for doing good governance in big water systems is IWRM, or Integrated Water Resources Management. And so it looks different in different places, a lot of different models, but typically a couple of things that you see are an explicit choice of river basins as that resource and user boundary. So some basin, some catchment where we can say all of the water that falls here goes to this group of people in the basin. A real emphasis on participatory processes to tease out what those rules are, to adapt systems and to provide monitoring, and a real emphasis on prices as this important tool to communicate water scarcity. Now, it's done well, it's done a lot of great things, but it's been around long enough and it's big enough that it's got critics. And some of the key criticisms that come out for IWRM is that sometimes when you see good things coming out from IWRM, what you're really seeing are underlying strong collective action processes that have nothing to do with IWRM. Sometimes it also may be the case that the river basin isn't the sort of problem locus. It's not the best place. And as well, sometimes having more people participate isn't the better thing. It's a thing that sounds great, have people involved. Obviously, it's wonderful, but sometimes that's not what's going to resolve your issue. And lastly, and this is the big one, from what we've talked about, this idea of good governance is creating the appropriate space to decide what the right objectives are. If IWRM comes in and tells you everything that you need to be doing, then we're stepping a little bit away from the freedom that good governance is supposed to be. So these are things to keep in mind. IWRM, as far as I know, is the best thing we've got so far, but it's not without its problems. So when we think about the Indus Basin system, again, I want to go back to this idea. Good governance means that we want to create centers of governance that exist around the problems that matter at the scales that matter. And a lot of investments in trying to make this work in Pakistan. We have recently ended, a 3-decade experiment in Punjab in participatory irrigation management, that among other things may have had this intent. And what I want to talk about for just a moment is just when we think about PIM and what it could and couldn't do, we evaluate what might have been possible. And we recall, for instance, the Indus Basin system wasn't built by irrigators for irrigators. It was built by colonists who didn't have experience irrigating in their home country. It was new, and it wasn't built out to all of the irrigators. The colonists built big main channels, and it was the privileged elites that were able to connect to it. And so there's this history of privilege embedded in a lot of the IBIS structure. It's something to be aware of, right? As we look at it, to just know the logic underlying where things started isn't necessarily what was in the best interests of the community of resource users. And importantly, the hydraulic communities created by a water course into the Kalpanchayat or into the collection of water courses that become the farmers organization don't necessarily meet these basic criteria from CPR theory as centers of governance. They aren't necessarily communities of users of common interest who can choose to participate or not, who can tailor their own. Those things aren't necessarily there. And so all this to say, in many cases, we saw great things coming out of KPs and FOs, but even where they work in practice, I think it's helpful to remind ourselves there isn't reason in theory to believe that they should. So what does that imply? Some of the more recent scholarship criticizing IWRM has said, let's not decide in advance what it should always be, but let's take what we're calling a problem shed approach, which is the idea of finding a way to sort of identify and contain interrelated problems at whatever scale, whose joint and coupled solution then leads to some water resources strategy at that scale. And so what does it mean here? If I'm being candid, I don't totally know yet. This is a little bit where we're stuck as researchers, but where our work started was very much motivated by what is it that you can get from the KP and the farmers organizations? What can they do? What can't they do? And I think we moved on a little bit to say, well, if it's not going to be PIM and Kalpanchayats and farmers organizations, then what else is it going to be? And the work that I showed earlier, I presented it as in prep, but really it's been in review and it's been sent back to us a number of times, in part because we tried to be really prescriptive about this and thinking that we knew. And I think really we don't quite know, but perhaps a better critical question is, and I think this is a thing to consider for the IBIS, what are the most important problem sheds that we can identify? What are the problems that we can link together and what scales do they represent? And I think when you get to that, that's this really important next contribution to think about the big picture, next governance picture for the IBIS. And in that is this freedom to sort of set aside the expectation that the solutions to good governance lie in the scales that we're so comfortable in working with the water courses, with the distributaries. It might be there, but it could very well be that it's somewhere else. Okay. So there's a lot that we can do operationally to improve water governance in the IBIS while we kind of chew through that bigger picture question that, again, I don't necessarily have an answer for. So I want to talk for a little bit about that sort of, I want to move down from the third triple loop learning to our double loop learning and think about how can we improve the objectives we can set? How do we improve the toolkits we have access to? So when I talked earlier about hierarchies, markets, and networks, really these modes of governance represent kind of two different sets of tools. Governments are able to provide subsidies, set quotas, set caps, levy taxes. Markets are able to identify prices, facilitate trade, and the networks of people through civil society, NGOs, family, kinship, are able to watch, are able to generate culture, to create their own local rules and norms, and keep people tied together in that way. Now, when we're governing things, it's not it's not typically an either or. There are very few things that we build just with a hammer. So we're often bundling different tools together from across these toolkits. And so you can think of cool public-private partnerships like the public companies for water supply and sanitation in KPK province. We also think about, you see this in many spots around the world, these cap and trade systems of establishing an overall cap and allowing a market to determine fair prices and trading for pollutant loading rights. So those are examples of kind of bundling those toolkits together. Really central to the success of any of these is good information. And for the IBIS system in particular, where we have water flowing across millions and millions of kilometers of channels, often at very slow speeds, dropping out sediment and fouling, it's very difficult to provide that information. Now, this is an area that we've spent some work exploring. And I want to talk for just a few minutes about what we found here. So one of the first things that we did to look at the role of information, this is going back about 10 years, we designed a little game, played on little handheld tablets, where players organized along a hypothetical channel made choices about how much water to take for their crops, how much to invest in that shared public good of irrigation infrastructure, and as well take other actions either to privately lobby to increase their offtake or to protest what they believed or could observe were the offtakes of others. And I won't get into too many details about the results here, although this paper is in the folder that I shared, should you want to dig into that while we're talking. Sanctions and the ability to protest other people's allocations, that was important. But even more than that was information. We saw big differences in what happened when people could know what other people were getting versus when they just had to guess. And that's great, it's a fun little game, but we were able to go one step further and see how that played out in a real irrigation system. And so we conducted this long field experiment in a distributary in Punjab, looking at what happens, we're not moving all the way into a pricing system. We're not necessarily changing what farmers do, but just providing information so people know what's happening. What does that do? And so my colleague Azim spent a year, 2 years, testing and designing different approaches to measure reliably under this sort of harsh environment. And it's a challenge, right? Water's dropping out sediment, it's fouling, things get tampered with. It's a difficult measurement problem. But where he landed, and I understand as well, in your water center area, you have similar tools in place in other parts of the system, but an ultrasonic depth measurement at the level of the distributary outlet. So just above the watercourse outlet, measuring what the flow rate was as a signal of what was going into the watercourse. And so that's what we're able to provide along all, I think, 17 outlets in a distributary. And we watched the system for a little bit more than a year. And we saw some really cool things. So we conducted a baseline survey of farmers' perceptions about what they were getting and their sense of, water-related conflicts within the WUA, as well as outside. And what we observed was, in this particular year, we actually ended up with overall lower water receipt into that distributary than had been received the year before. But farmers reported that they were getting more water. So we measured how much water they were receiving by the sort of fraction of the turns on which they reported receiving all the water they were supposed to. So it looked like they were getting about 1/6 more water than they had. That's what they were saying. But we knew, in fact, that they were actually getting less in this year, just by chance. And importantly, they shifted the kinds of conflicts that they were experiencing and reporting. So in the prior year, they had been blaming tube wells along the distributary as responsible for, maybe leading to leakage and reducing the water that they were getting, to now complaining about others in their own water course for not contributing sufficiently to maintenance. So what this was is not complaining anymore that they weren't getting water, but complaining that it wasn't being used appropriately. So this is whether or not they do anything different. This is just by letting people know what they're getting. We've transformed how they're seeing the resource and where they're looking to find solutions. So this is in revision. We're hoping to be out soon. I'm really excited about that result. But we've also invested a little bit in not just what they see, but what might change what farmers do. How am I doing for time? Okay, we're good. So we took a few behavioral experiments called discrete choice experiments. And these are a tool you see widely used in economics. They're a market research tool that allow us to understand how different aspects, different attributes in a choice matter to the people making those choices. So we conduct them by constructing and showing respondents a series of choice cards where they're asked to choose between 1 or 2 or 3 different hypothetical options, or to say, no, I don't want any of that. I just want to stick with what I have. And so here's an example of one of the experiments that we did that I'll explain in just a moment. The way it works is you can set up a basic model on the attributes. You can suggest that the utility that someone derives is some linear, or however you want to set up your equation. But here, this is a main effects only representation of the basic attributes of that prior decision of around irrigation, how much you would spend, how much groundwater you would need, how reliable the surface water component was, how saline your groundwater was. And you have this ordinal data from those choices of what's preferred to what. And you have thousands of these. So typically you'll ask a respondent to make 6 or 7 or 8 choices. And if you've got a few hundred respondents, you very quickly get a massive data set from which you can fit your utility model and estimate. You get these regression coefficients where the ratio of any 2 of those coefficients is something called a marginal rate of substitution. So it's a measure of, for instance, how much more saline I would accept my groundwater if I had to pay less for it, for instance, or how much reliability in surface water I would sacrifice if I had paid less. And in particular, where you have a cost attribute, you can get this idea of a marginal willingness to pay. So how much more would I pay in order to improve my access to reliable surface water? So we did a couple of these experiments. In this first experiment, where we looked at irrigation water supply and cost, we learned a few things. So, and this may be well known to those of you in the room, irrigators in Pakistan pay a lot of money to fuel their pumps. They pay a lot in diesel to pump groundwater. And what that translates into is a latent willingness to pay for surface water that is much, much higher than what people pay. So in our particular case, it was around up to about 20,000 rupees per acre per season for the kind of reliable surface water comparable to what they could get from pumping the groundwater. And importantly, those who were getting more water now, those who are getting more reliable water now, were willing to pay more. And this is an important thing because economically, this implies something called an upward sloping demand curve, which tells us a little bit about the regime of the resource that we're working in. So we ran another experiment a few years later in conjunction with the PIPIP, the Punjab Irrigation Productivity Improvement Project, which you may be familiar with is a subsidy to adopt drip irrigation systems. And so we built a sample across people who hadn't tried drip, who were relying on wells, who were part of the canal systems, a lot of variation in what people had access to. And we found a couple of things. Those who had experience with using drip liked it more. But this isn't a causal story because we only went and asked once. So those who have experience or reported experience with drip, we don't know if they started liking it more and thus were more likely to have adopted it. So we really have to go back again and look at changes. We haven't been able to do that yet, but it's helpful to know. Those who have used it like it more. And many farmers who hadn't definitely wanted to try it, but didn't have access for one reason or another. And this is important. Among those who really wanted to do drip or to do more with drip, aspired to very different agricultural landscapes than what they were doing. They may be invested in wheat and maize, but many farmers reported thinking about olives and oranges and just a very different space than what they were currently doing. So taking these experiments together, it paints this picture for what the sort of Pakistan's agricultural landscape could look like. So it suggests, so here's this sort of space where we see this upward sloping demand curve and sort of this increasing willingness to pay at the margin, which suggests that farmers are able, as their water supply improves, to move into doing things that they couldn't do otherwise. So moving from low value to high value crops, eventually getting to a point where we see that common downward sloping demand curve where I no longer benefit as much from each marginal unit of water, but we're not there yet. And so this story sort of says, farmers that are willing to pay so much for water could finance this massive improvement to the irrigation system. And as well, things like drip, as much as they may also lead to overall increases in water consumption, could really change at the same time water and land productivity in the system. And so there's a lot of potential to tip the landscape into something very different. But there's an open question that we haven't really addressed, which is who benefits from that and who doesn't. So we took those experimental results and we threw them into a simulation. We built an agent-based model of irrigators along channels. So an agent-based model is a tool where we model decisions and interactions among individuals and with their environment, where some system level outcome emerges from those interactions. So things like equity, things like landscape productivity emerge out of what individual agents, in this case irrigators, are doing. So our irrigators here were making a land use choice about what they would crop and for how much, over how much land, based on their expectations of what water they would receive. And they also paid abiana based on our experimental results proportionally to what they got, up to some maximum around the result that we observed of around 23,000 rupees per acre season. And we did a little bit of sort of face validation on a number of sort of common crops, and we saw that the model performed as you might expect. So we see this movement away from, as water reliability, so moving to the right of all of these plots, as water reliability increases, we see a movement towards more sort of higher value vegetables, away from lower value cotton, wheat, whichever. So in our experiments, and these are all in this paper that I cite there, it's in the folder, we looked at production outcomes and equity outcomes across a range of different channel configurations. And what we saw was that asking for more money from farmers to pay abiana and then investing those fees in improved reliability led unquestionably to both improved production and reduced inequality. So more efficient, more equitable. So that's great, right? That's really exciting. We fixed irrigation. It's exciting because it's pro-poor and it's sort of trickle down at the same time, but it's a very specific stylized example. And importantly, it's this case where those who, and this is true in irrigation systems in this sort of true trickle down sense, you can't help but help the people behind you when you help yourself. Meaning when I invest in irrigation infrastructure, for me, it leads to benefits for people behind me. And that's not always true. But it's this great condition where these benefits are non-excludable. I generate through my own actions non-excludable benefits for my peers in the system if we can set this up. And the key thing here is tapping into real humans' willingness to pay. People have to observe and experience this improvement to be willing to contribute back. So I want to just close with another sort of 5 minutes or so. I want to put this in context, this specific result in context, with a metaphor that I hope speaks to some in the room. And it's something I know that we're all familiar with. This is not a silly privileged person's reference. This is thinking about pro-poor governance with Mario Kart. And I use this because everybody knows Mario Kart. Maybe not everybody, but if you don't play Mario Kart, then some child in your orbit plays Mario Kart and has told you about Mario Kart. And what's great about Mario Kart, it's been around forever. It came out when I was a kid. It's fancy now, you can play it on your phone, you got lots of cool things. It's been around for decades because it's fun, even when you're terrible at it. And the reason it does this is that it has this built-in equity design principle. And that is basically all the carts that are at the back, whoever they are, go faster and they get better items. You get these items to either make you go faster or knock the other cars out. You get better items when you're at the back. This is this principle that they came up with that now you see across the gaming world. It's called Rubberbanding. And it's got a couple of parts that have relevance to the way we think about designing interventions and good resource governance systems. So it works in Mario Kart because the game designer can, without cost, know who's in the back and know how far away they are from the front. They can generate boosts. They can make items out of nothing. And this is the hard part. They can target those items at the people in the back. This is like the super hard part. Right? So it's great. It's not so easy in the real world. Now, in part, if I think about what rubber banding can mean in like the global north, in strong welfare states, imagine this sort of splat of bubble gum at the bottom here as being some sort of distribution of well-being outcomes from low up to high, with some lump of the most of us in the middle. In a lot of welfare states, we have progressive taxation systems that bring resources out. And maybe, if I'm being fair, at least where part of the world I live in looks more like this. But where this leads to payments to targeted pro-poor social programs, or as well, universal social programs like subsidized healthcare, subsidized childcare, et cetera, that benefit people enough to kind of tie people more closely together. That's the sort of modern welfare state, ethos of rubber banding. Elsewhere, in rural spaces in the global north and across the global south, we don't necessarily have the same levels of capacity, and it's harder to do. But the link I want to make back to the things I talked about with irrigation earlier is here, and the importance of technologies, monitoring, evaluation, and importantly, mobile phones. And so the degree to which smartphones are now penetrating across the urban and rural worlds everywhere is making it much easier to achieve these difficult parts of rubber banding, knowing where people are, generating boosts, and targeting them at the back. So I'll just close really quickly with a note about how. So the challenges, and I'm sure we're all very aware of this, that the poorest people are often the least integrated and the hardest to reach. And so in the research space, our social data collection approaches typically don't get at that. We're not able to overcome this challenge of reaching these hard to reach people. And it changes with mobile phones, and not because we're creepers and we're following people, but it allows us to transform how we engage with people. Android phones are really cheap, and the expansion of mobile wallet services like paying your bills, buying credits for solar power, whichever, things that you can do more easily through your phone than you could ever do before, crowd in participation and use of smartphones. And so, again, as researchers, we think through this towards this new world where the money we used to spend to go and try and track people, the money we spent on hiring enumerators to run surveys and fuel and lodging, can be channeled into this sort of positive externality of increased access to mobile services, right? So we pay a little bit of money to anybody who wants to engage with us, report with us, let us know how they're doing. And on the development side, mobile phones on their own they don't make the boosts, but they do allow us to see a little bit better what it is that people are doing and evaluate those, monitor them, and reward them. So we can transform what it costs to evaluate and monitor a program. And this is really important across a lot of contexts. It allows us to move from development programs that effectively are handouts because the transaction costs of following up and seeing what people are doing are too prohibitive. It allows us to make payments for things truly conditional. People provide evidence to demonstrate they've done what they said they did. And that allows us to better reward contributions, through e-wallet credits for this or that. And importantly, knowing where people are, knowing what's happening, allows us to go one step further and target where we focus our attention, target where we plan interventions to be. So really what I'm getting at is this idea that mobile phones, ICTs, allow the governance toolkits that we started with to go even further and do more interesting things. And so the more that we're able to crowd in people's engagement with mobile phones, the more effective we can be in governing. So specifically for this irrigation case, let me go back to Mario Kart for a moment. And I want to compare that to irrigation. I'm going to use a systems causal approach to talk this through. So on the left, imagine, this is the Mario Kart problem. You have someone in the front, someone in the back. That gap between them is what drives the rubber banding behavior. So here, I'm going to draw a bunch of arrows with plus or minus signs. And so a plus sign on an arrow here means change in the same direction. So as the leader gets further ahead, the gap between they and the person in the back increases. That's what I'm saying there. And so as that gap increases, this increase in speed to the person in the back, which then leads them further along, reducing that gap. That's that first sort of balancing feedback loop. And as well, we have a similar quality of bonus item loop, driving them further forward to the front. So that's the sort of set of rubber banding loops in Mario Kart. In an irrigation system, we have people at the front, we have people in the back. So we have some supply at the inlet that's leading to the more water we have, the more we withdraw. And ideally, there's more in water fees being paid. I don't know if that's actually the case, but that's an ideal case. We also, the more water coming in at the inlet means more water at the tail, more water withdrawn at the tail, and hopefully more paid at the tail. But the key thing here is that more withdrawal at the inlet also leads to lower supply at the tail. This is this head to tail problem. There's potential for exciting positive feedback loops of we pay more, we get more infrastructure spending, and we get better supply to the inlet, and that's great. And that's kind of what we looked at in the model I presented earlier. But we know in practice, if we're not charging enough and we haven't made a point to charge people what they can afford to pay or what they're willing to pay, we won't get that. And so this is where things like mobile phones can step in and make a big change. If we believe, for instance, that it makes sense to target our attention to spaces where the gap between head and tail withdrawal is the greatest, and focus our efforts on fee assessment greater when that gap is greater, we then kind of enhance that reinforcing feedback that can improve an irrigation system. So I present this here as just an example of where our ability to create a true information feedback is what allows us potentially to transform a system that wasn't rubber banding into something that is much more likely to be. So what does that mean for where we are? And I say this having learned a little bit about the work that you're doing at your center and having thought about what has and hasn't worked for us. For me, behavioral experiments are this key frontier to move forward. And I say that knowing that, being able to make assumptions about what people do and then identify what's optimal for a system given that fixed behavior is this really important, valuable puzzle. But to the extent that we can enhance that by building in an understanding of, how frustrating and weird real people are in the way that they actually make decisions, it's this much more sort of rewarding outcome. And so there are cool experiments, important experiments we can design to understand how is it that we can optimize how people engage over time with mobile phone tasks. How do we improve reliability and long-term engagement? And then outside of that, how is it that people actually respond to the different kinds of incentives we provide? What are the limitations in their ability to adopt some new practice? How is it that connections across different people matter? Lots of different things that we could talk about, but this is the bigger picture direction that I think is really new and exciting. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've got a few minutes. Okay, so I talked a little longer than I expected to, but let me just wrap up. So we talked about governance, and we've used this working definition of it's about creating appropriate spaces and tools in order to set objectives. Management is then about meeting those objectives. And both of these things get much harder as systems grow. So the IBIS is really, really, really big. And I pointed towards thinking from a problem sheds perspective as the next sort of point to maybe make that happen. Now, while the big picture stuff is happening, there's lots of exciting work that we can do at the sort of double loop learning scale, improving information feedbacks, and really just the more we learn about how people are able to make choices, the more both simultaneously productive and pro-poor we can make our system. So I think I talked a little longer than I meant to. I apologize, and I'll leave that there.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, for the wonderful presentation. I'm now going to invite Q&A from the audience. So there are a few ways in which the questions can be asked. So you can either raise your hand, will allow you to speak, or you can just type into the Q&A and we can ask Andrew to answer that. it would be preferable if you can type it into the Q&A box instead of the chat. So that makes it easier for us to organize. So, we already have one question from, so I know this is Dhruba from Kolkata in India, who's asking, did you factor in uncertainty and conflict resolution into your work?
So that's a great question. And so when people's response to uncertainty is this super important thing to resolve, particularly, when we're thinking about adaptation to climate change and all these things like that haven't happened yet that we want to understand how people might respond. And it's really difficult to get at. And the answer that I've been, or the example I've been highlighting when I talk about this recently is we've all lived through in the last 18 months this big shock that none of us had ever experienced. And we kind of got used to it, and we found ways to make things work. But none of us probably could have predicted well in advance how it was that we were going to respond to the uncertainty we were facing under COVID. It's a really challenging thing to measure. And so we haven't, in the work that we've done so far, done a really good job of capturing how people's uncertainty about irrigation shapes what they're doing. But it's an important thing that you can try to do with behavioral experiments. The challenge is this process of introducing and framing uncertainty in your experiments so that you can credibly believe that your respondents understand this and aren't just learning as they go. So what I mean to say that is we want to be able to disentangle the experience of people's confronting real uncertainty from their uncertainty in learning your experiment in your game. This is a challenge to do. It's something you can do better with mobile phones-based engagement because we can stay in touch with people for so long. So that may only be part of your question, but thank you for asking because it's a thing I wanted to make sure I said.
All right, thank you. So we have another question from Dr. Afreen Siddiqui. So she's asking if you can comment on the role of power in understanding farmers' behavior and overall governance in WTP.
That's another great question as well. And I may give an answer that sounds a lot like the answer I just gave about uncertainty. And I don't mean for it to be unsatisfying. But certainly we know a lot about the sort of like, pre-existing power asymmetries that exist, not only just within a water course, but then across water courses that can be challenging to measure. And so I would say to do a sort of a power representative assessment across different users from head to tail within water courses, across water courses is really important to try and, we know that it's there. We want to see how we can measure it. We haven't done that kind of work so far. We haven't designed any kind of experiment so far where our goal was to try and assess or measure differences in power. But it's so critically important to do in order to understand, where are our greatest opportunities for improving equity, changing what people do. I apologize for unsatisfying answers where I'm just repeating back your question, but these are really important things that I think, in that last slide, there's this whole world of behavioral experiments that we could invest in and learn a lot about what can improve the system.
All right, thank you. So we have the next question from Laila Aman, who's asking, how could we transform the Indus Basin with climate resilient agriculture and water management, where the water governance and management is very poor?
Yeah, it's a great and very big question. And I think operationally, and I may just be repeating, some of the stuff from the last part of my talk, but it's learning how to reach people in the back is, it's really difficult, but opportunities through mobile networks are transforming this a little bit. And so to the extent that we can, scale up our ability to engage with people across space at high frequency via mobile phones, then transforms our ability to collect social data. And those in the room who've done research in the natural and physical sciences are maybe comfortable with talking about sea surface temperature anomalies or rainfall anomalies that all imply we have a baseline understanding how things ought to be or typically are, so that when things are outside of normal, we notice them. We can't do that in the social sciences. We can't even know, like typically we don't engage in really detailed data collection with anything until something's already gone wrong. We follow the famine. And it means that we miss all kinds of things. We miss developing an understanding of the conditions that prevent famines and many disasters in the first place. So my answer to your question is really, I believe that this first part falls to us to leverage modern technologies to design a platform and program for regular high frequency engagement across people so that we have some true idea of a socioeconomic baseline, which we've never had before.
All right, thank you. So we have a little more time. So maybe I can take the liberty of asking a question myself. So you mentioned that one of the criticisms of integrated water resource management is that the good outcomes aren't necessarily something good, but are due to something underlying in the IWRM frameworks. So this is something which is very interesting for us at the center, and we have been looking at it for some while now. Can you elaborate a bit on what type of effects you meant there?
Sure. And so this is something that's been examined as well. So like in the many evaluations of success in participatory irrigation management in Punjab, for instance, we have the same problem where, for instance, the choices of where to establish or where to implement the reform and establish water users associations and farmer organizations is made in part by where you think that they're going to be successful. So you have this selection problem already, where it's difficult to know whether good outcomes are attributable to the thing you put in place or the underlying conditions that allowed you to put them in place in the first place. And so what specifically are we talking about? I mean, we have experience from across the world where groups of people get together and find ways to manage resources on their own. And in contexts where there are sort of strong degrees of collective action, meaning like strong proclivity to contribute to common public goods and invest in things that benefit the people around us, that can lead to really good resource outcomes, irrespective of whatever you've layered on top of this. And so it's a really hard thing to evaluate. But I think finding ways to, again, disentangle these things. What cultural rules and what degrees of collective action pre-exist the sort of institutions we layer on top is really important in order to be able to understand things like IWRM. There's no easy way to get around this. It's just a challenge.
All right, so I see we all still have some questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So so first of all, before I'll ask Dr. Abubakar to conclude, I just want to add that for those who are asking about it, the recording will be made available somewhere. It's not finalized yet, but don't worry, we'll communicate it to you. And any other queries that you may have, you can send us an email. We can try to answer any of your queries, or any other feedback regarding the seminar, the sessions. Please, we're happy to receive them. And so once more, because there's a shortage of time, we weren't able to address all of the questions. So, Dr. Abubakar.
Thanks. And Taha just wanted to remind that we need actually the speaker's consent before we start sharing the video publicly or within the participants. Let's make sure that with Andrew later on, and then also with other speakers, we take that before we do so. But as Andrew is giving us a thumbs up, I think this would be a wonderful archive if some of these talks can be put online for later viewing, some of the people who may not have been able to see today. I am particularly excited today to see those feedback loops. This is something that I have been doing all my life, tuning feedback loops. That's what my background is. And I already begin to wonder what will be the sort of the temporal dynamics of these kind of feedbacks, and where the system will settle, and meanwhile how the process will respond, because we usually think of these processes as static. I think there is tremendous opportunity for basic research in this area. This concept of bringing in these cybernetic kind of feedback, like ideas, and marrying them to these very complex systems. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for researchers who are out there, and to make it work for a system as complex as even a Khal Panchayat or an FO. I think that will be a landmark achievement if and whoever is able to figure that out. So this is really a wonderful idea to pursue, and all the best to Dr. Bell's team and his collaborators who have been doing some really excellent work in the past decade. Over to you, Talha.
All right, so thank you so much, Andrew. And with this, we can conclude the webinar. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you in participating in the other talks of the series as well.
Thank you all.